Good evening. Welcome to St. Anthony's Spirituality Center for our 2021 Know Your Faith series, The Social Justice Teachings of the Church. This evening, we have Father Tom Lindner, who will be speaking on life and dignity of the human person. I am Sister Barb, Sister of St. Joseph, Third Order of St. Francis. I am the hosting coordinator here at St. Anthony's. Again, we have Tracy helping us with our video and cameras. Take it off. Sorry about that. There are a few things before we start. First of all, those online, please keep your video and camera and your microphones off until the end. We'll have question and answer then. We are Zoom participants will receive a survey to fill out and PowerPoint tomorrow. Those present here have an evaluation form on your tables. We ask that you provide us with feedback on tonight's program. This helps us to continue to learn having virtual, in-person, and recorded Zoom presentations. We have not charged for these sessions, but we are requesting free will offering donation. There is a basket up front here for those in person. We have a number of different ways you can donate. You can go to our website. You can donate on our Facebook page. You can mail a check to St. Anthony's, or you can call the office and donate by credit card. We appreciate anything you offer us to help. We are greatly appreciative for the generous grant we received from the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in La Crosse. This helped us to purchase a computer, camera, microphone, and software. This allows us to do this hybrid session of people joining us virtually and in person. This will let us reach many people for years to come. Our speaker tonight is Father Tom Lindner, currently the pastor at St. Anne Parish in Wausau. He was ordained a priest for the Diocese of La Crosse 26 years ago. For 21 years of those 26, he worked with the college students at UWSP and MSTC as the pastor of the Newman University Parish in Stevens Point. In 2014, he was assigned as pastor of St. Stanislaus Parish. In doing this, he took on the responsibility of preparing the two parishes for the merger on July 1 of 2015 to become the first pastor of Holy Spirit Parish. Please help me welcome Father Tom Lindner.
Thank you, Sister Barb. Thank you to those who are gathered here in Marathon and those who are joining us online. So I thought I had done a lot of COVID technology experiences, or have had a lot of COVID technology experiences, but I haven't done this one yet. So this could be an adventure for us tonight to see how this works. Sister Barb didn't mention that she was part of our staff at Holy Spirit Parish when we were created on July 1 of 2015. And so, but as she said, I've been at St. Anne's now for 3 years. In terms of Holy Spirit Parish and St. Anne's, one of the challenges when you go from one parish to another parish is when you answer the phone or talk about the new parish at a meeting or something, that you don't say the name of the old parish. And I had done very well. Mike's here from St. Anne's. I don't think I ever slipped up before Mike until Saturday night, which was Pentecost. So I had a good excuse. But I started Mass. I said, hello, Holy Spirit. Oh, and I stopped myself. And someone in the back says, that was 3 years ago. So as I was saying, the subtitle is An Opportunity and a Challenge of Imagination and Attitude. So because of the technology challenges tonight, that may require a lot of imagination on my part or Tracy's part, I'm not sure, but also may require some attitude adjustment on my part as well. So I'm not sure what that title meant before, but now maybe I have a better idea. How many of you, so this will be somewhat interactive. So I can't just talk for 90 minutes and you wouldn't want to hear me talk for 90 minutes. So how many of you, and this is just for folks here who are gathered in the room because we can't be really in too much conversation with people, the 30 some folks, I guess, who are with us on Zoom. How many of you have heard before of the consistent ethic of life? In some way, you've heard the term, okay? And so those who have heard of it, do you have, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being I have no interest in it or any tolerance of it, with 10 being like a full embrace, where are you on the scale? 10 and 10, okay. So those of you who have not heard of it before, certainly hope, I mean, even regardless of how far I lead anyone astray, you'll be able to say that you've heard of it before, which I think is very important. And I may address this later. It's quite unfortunate that you have not heard of it before and that it hasn't really been a guiding principle for you and for others in our church as we've addressed matters of life over the last 30 some years, or no more than that, 40 some years. Since this idea really became somewhat prominent within our church. In terms of myself, when I was in the seminary, I had a class on the consistent ethic of life. So as you'll discover, the primary figure in introducing this idea and establishing this opportunity and challenge was Cardinal Joseph Bernadine, who at the time was the Archbishop of Chicago. And the class that I had on the consistent ethic of life was with his moral theologian, who probably prepared many of the addresses and things that Cardinal Bernadine presented on the consistent ethic of life. But that was, as Sister Barb mentioned, 30 years ago. I was ordained 26 years this June, but I was in the seminary 30 years ago. So it had been a long time since I had really studied the consistent ethic of life. I knew what it was. I had a 10 appreciation of it, but I hadn't read Cardinal Bernadine's addresses. I hadn't really spent a lot of time pondering it too much. And so this was a great opportunity for me to rediscover, first of all, how prophetic Cardinal Bernadine was, and to kind of renew my appreciation for the intricacies of the Christian ethic of life, or the consistent ethic of life, which really is a Christian ethic of life as well. So to gain that appreciation and kind of be renewed in that. Now, when I accepted the invitation to do this talk, I thought in the back of my mind, well, I have notes from my seminary class with Father Place, who did such a great job, guiding Cardinal Bernadine and teaching our class. There were 5 of us in this class with this moral theologian. It was a great opportunity. And then I had my book, which has all of Cardinal Bernadine's addresses. So when I got earlier in the week, because I don't do this stuff too far in advance, that's just how it is. So I looked through the file for my notes from my consistent ethic of life class. And guess what? What do you think I did 3 years ago when I moved from Stevens Point to Wausau? I hadn't used them in 22 years. What was I going to need them for, right? Isn't that what we say? If you haven't used it in 5 years or whatever, you should throw it out. So I did. So I didn't have those. And then when I picked up my book, I thought, well, this looks rather new, and I'm looking through it, and none of the highlights or any of the things. So somehow my copy is with somebody else. I have a new copy, but it's not the highlighted copy that I expected. So that's when I really got to come into the consistent ethic on a kind of the ground floor again, which was fine too, because as I say, it was a good way to reacquaint myself with what Cardinal Bernadine had written. When we speak of a consistent ethic of life, I don't want us to think of something that just lives out in some realm of moral theology. I want us to see it as something that is rooted much more fundamentally in the gospel. So even if you don't know much about the consistent ethic of life, or for Paul and Mike here who do, what would be some gospel texts that you think speak well to aspects of life? We're talking about the Gospels now, so let's not go far afield. But what would be some gospel text stories of events in the life of Jesus or parables he told that speak well to matters of life? Yes, Paul.
I believe they say that.
I'll repeat it. Or can I repeat it? Okay.
That Lazarus is the poor. I believe they say that Lazarus is the only person named in any of the parables. I'm speaking of the poor man, and the rich man has been given the name Dives.
Sure. So the story of the rich man and Lazarus. If you can just go to the next slide, Tracy, please. And next one. So there you have it. Hey, we were on sync, huh? So no, that's not it. Go to the next one. Go to the next one and the next one. There, the next one. There we have the rich man and Lazarus. So I've kind of given you a heads up. Did you have an idea, Mike, of one? Or you can probably see it up there now.
Well, I was thinking in terms of the Beatitudes.
So certainly the Beatitudes would be a fundamental text for the consistent ethic of life. Yes.
The Good Samaritan?
So the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is pictured here. Yes. What else do we see? I think the feeding of the 5,000 or the how many thousands is a story of life, of being attentiveness to hunger and the needs of the people. I always like the story of the visitation. It doesn't seem like it's like a wow, that was really a powerful statement of life, but it's this attentiveness to one another, of being present to one another, kind of a fundamental awareness of life. And of course the life that Mary and Elizabeth carried inside of them as well. And then there's one more, and I think it all comes out most clearly in the greatest commandment: love one another. Okay, so what we are talking about tonight is not rooted in some academic presentations or the complexities of moral theology. It's rooted in the gospel of Jesus. And that only strengthens all of what I will be talking about tonight. Go to the next one. So when we talk about a consistent ethic of life, that sounds like a rather antiseptic, technical, scholarly term. It doesn't sound like something I would want to learn about, right? The consistent ethic of life. But what if we called it, next slide, one more, the seamless garment. How many of you do knitting or sewing or stuff like that? So you probably, I don't really know much about, I'm only going from what I'm told. But go back. What if, there, that's fine. What if this got snagged and we pulled that string out? What would happen to the fabric? It would all begin to kind of unravel, wouldn't it? It would be a mess. So the integrity of the garment is that it remains seamless, that there really be one complete piece of fabric there. Now, again, Jesus never talks about a consistent ethic of life, and Jesus never talks about a seamless garment. But if we look at chapter 12 in John's gospel, verse 23 to 24, this is what we find. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 shares, a share for each soldier. They also took his tunic, but the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top down. And so they said to one another, let's not tear it, but cast lots to see whose it will be, in order that the passage of scripture might be fulfilled that says, they divided my garments among them, and for my vesture they cast lots. And this is what the soldiers did. Ripping or somehow dividing the garment would have created shreds of cloth. The entire fabric would have been weakened or frayed, potentially even destroyed. They maintained what we might call a seamless garment. So that, I think, might be a more engaging phrase to think about rather than consistent ethic of life, that we talk about this as a seamless garment of understandings, of issues, of priorities, that has the more technical label, consistent ethic of life. So if we can go on, and one more. Okay, so let's get to where this all kind of began. This whole idea of the consistent ethic of life or the seamless garment isn't something that Cardinal Joseph Bernadine created, but he kind of brought it all together in a very clear, precise, understandable way, remarkably understandable. And it all began with an address he gave at Fordham University in December of 1983. You can go to the next slide or cue. So at this time, think about what's going on in the world and what influenced him in presenting this seamless garment idea. Okay, let's go one by one. So there's a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. So it's hard for us now to remember that, but remember we were all piling up these weapons and we were gonna, mutual assured destruction. We were never going to go to war with the other one because if they destroyed us, we destroyed them. What a world. I don't know that we're any different now, but at least we don't have that mindset. There were all of these civil wars in Central America. We know martyrs from our own region who were killed as part of that violence in Guatemala and El Salvador, Honduras, throughout Central America, and the United States having some role to play in those civil wars as well. The Roe v. Wade decision of 1973, which continues to weigh heavily upon us as Christians, as people who defend and promote life, and certainly the politics of our country. So it was a rather fresh idea, just 10 years away when Cardinal Bernadine spoke at Fordham in 1983. So that certainly has, that complex issue and deadly issue has continued to plague us. Debates on the death penalty. When he spoke at Fordham, there had just been an execution of a guy in Florida that had attracted a lot of national attention as well as the attention of Pope John Paul II. So there was a very fresh contemporary issue that brought life to that element of his address. Racism and civil rights. So we're just, fewer like 20 years or 15 years from the real intensity of the civil rights riots, protests, things, the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., et cetera. And still coming to terms with that as we are today. So as we can see, I mean, some of what we're talking about is different, but a lot of it's the same. And then issues of poverty, food, shelter, healthcare, education, growing disparity of income, which is even more pronounced in many ways today, and various means of inequality. So that's what was going on in the world that Cardinal Bernadine is trying to address as he speaks of this consistent ethic of life. He was prompted to begin this kind of delving into the consistent ethic by this document, The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. This was a pastoral letter by the bishops, the Catholic bishops of the United States. It was issued in May of 1980, it says 82, but it was really 83, I think. May of 1983, so that's wrong. Forget the slide. So this might be hard for you to understand or comprehend, but at this time, the bishops of the United States were so focused that they could collectively issue a pastoral letter ostensibly on war and peace, but it really addressed other aspects of life as well. And I'll talk to that shocking reality that they did this in a little bit more. Okay, the next. Cardinal Bernadine spoke of this document and what it offered to our country. He spoke of it as a new moment. Okay. And he says, I believe, this is in his speech at Fordham, speaking of the challenge of peace. I believe the long-term ecclesiological, the significance to the church of this pastoral rests with the lessons it offers about the church's capacity to dialogue with the world in a way which helps to shape the public policy debate on key issues. He was imagining the Catholic Church being in dialogue, helping to shape policy, to identify issues that need to be addressed by public policy. That was this new moment where the church would really, the Church in the United States at least, would really take to heart what the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Church in the Modern World envisioned, and that the church would not just be a passive bystander to world events, but would be leading the way in identifying and addressing realities in the world. Okay. And just as a side note, even more remarkable in our current environment than the 1983 pastoral letter on peace or war and peace, it was followed in 1986 by another pastoral letter on economic justice. There has never been a pastoral letter from the US bishops as substantive as either of those since 1986. More on that later. If I don't remember, remind me, okay? How many of you have heard of either of those pastoral letters? Okay, so about the same who have heard of the consistent ethic of life. And they are really still profound, but forgotten, okay? So again, this was renewing my connection with the consistent ethic of life, kind of brought me back in connection with those two documents, okay? Okay. So again, addressing the challenge of peace, Cardinal Bernadine says, the principal conclusion is that the church's social policy role is at least as important in defining key questions. So identifying what needs to be addressed. The key questions in the public debate as important as in deciding such questions. So it can't just be a matter of us saying, well, this is what we should do. We also need to recognize the problem that needs to be addressed and then helping to identify a solution. The principal okay, next. The US bishops have created the new moment. We have helped shape the debate. Wow. Drop the mic. I won't. See what I have next. Otherwise, I have a question. Okay. The central idea in the letter is the sacredness of human life. Let's save that for a moment. So go back to the other one, Tracy. The other page. The one just before this one. This one here, I think. Nope, the next one, this one, 7. So He says, the US bishops have created this new moment. We have helped shape the debate. How'd they do? There's still a debate. How are they doing in shaping the debate?
Well, initially quite well.
Right. But today, not so much. Today, not so much. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll get to that let's go to the next slide. I just think that statement, there's so much hope. That statement just reeks of hope and possibility, right? So that's why it's kind of hard to read it almost. So again, referring to the pastoral on peace. So this is fundamental to the discussion of war and peace that the bishops put forth. The central idea in the letter is the sacredness of human life and the responsibility we have personally and socially to protect and preserve the sanctity of life. Right? Okay. But isn't it interesting that this isn't a document on war and peace? Okay. Let's go to the next piece. Precisely because life is sacred, the taking of even one human life is a momentous event. And so that leads to the question, should life ever be taken? Before we get to the answer of that question, let's talk a little bit about, well, any comments or questions before I go any further? Clarification. Sorry, we can't ask the people at home that on Zoom, but anyone? Any comments or questions? Okay. So who is this man, Bernadine? How many of you have heard of Cardinal Bernadine before tonight? Okay, so a few more of you have heard of him. Let's find out a little bit more about him. When he became the the Archbishop of Chicago, and we'll get the date in a moment, let's see. When he became the Archbishop of Chicago, we'll see the date in a moment, the year. Chicago was a church that was, just kind of low on energy, struggling to get along. They had had a long battle, or long ordeal with their previous archbishop. They were in financial debt, low morale among the priests. We'd gone through the civil rights unrest and things like that. And so when he appeared the night before his installation as the Archbishop of Chicago, there was an evening prayer gathering at Holy Name Cathedral, downtown Chicago, with the priests of the Archdiocese. And Cardinal Bernadine walks in and he says to them, "Hello, I am Joseph, your brother." Well, those people fell in love with him immediately, because the humility that he brought just in that statement was so different than anything they had experienced in the previous 20 years or more, that Bernadine really established himself in those 5 words: "I am Joseph, your brother." Okay. So he was born in 1928 in Columbia, South Carolina, which I think is the most amazing detail of his biography, because and we will hear him speak a little bit later, you would have never known he was from South Carolina to hear him speak. He got rid of his accent really fast, which is curious because he was in Cincinnati at some point as well, and there's some accents there. His parents were Italian immigrants. His father died when he was very young, and he began college as a pre-med major. So oftentimes, especially bishops or those who ascended to the hierarchy of the church, especially at that time, followed a pretty set pattern of maybe high school seminary, but then usually college seminary, where you're on a track, you're in a certain place and a little set apart from other students, people your age, from the general population. And then, of course, seminary itself. But he began college as a pre-med major. So he was going to college with other men and women and, I would say normal people. Not that seminarians aren't normal, but, well. So he started college just as, many of your children would do, or like as I did. In 1952, he was ordained a priest for Columbia, South Carolina. And then in 1966, Pope Paul VI appointed him an auxiliary bishop of Atlanta. Now, along with that assignment, he was the rector of the cathedral in Atlanta, which I think is also an important thing for us to know, because as a rector of a cathedral in an inner city area, he had interactions with real people. He wasn't just going to celebrate confirmation and doing things bishops do. He, as a rector or a pastor of that cathedral, was engaged in the lives of the people in that city. In 1968, he was the first general secretary of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, which now is known as the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And he had a key role in his role as general secretary. He was significant in establishing the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which works to address poverty in inner cities, developing programs to help bring people up out of poverty situations, and continues to exist for that purpose today. You can go to the next. In 1972, Pope Paul VI appointed him Archbishop of Cincinnati and president. And then while he was serving in Cincinnati, he was the president of the NCCB and chair of the Committee on War and Peace. And it was in that role that he guided the pastoral letter that we spoke of earlier, the pastoral letter on war and peace. That came out in 1983. Let's look at the next slide. He, a U.S. bishop, was on the cover of Time magazine. I believe it's November of 1983. God and the Bomb, Catholic Bishops Debate Nuclear Morality. Imagine a bishop on the cover of a magazine for something other than clergy abuse. Isn't that something? This was the gospel being preached on the cover of Time magazine and Cardinal Bernadine's picture. So let's look at the next one. In 1982, he had already at that time had, while the challenge of peace was being promulgated, et cetera, he became the Archbishop of Chicago, appointed by Pope John Paul II, and named to the College of Cardinals a year later. He was also then chair of the Bishop's Pro-Life Committee. And it was in that role, let's go to the next slide, that he initiated the series of lectures on the consistent ethic of life, or the seamless garment. So Bernadine brought a very different approach. I don't know, that was a fairly new entity, because until Roe v. Wade, there really wasn't the kind of dedicated focus on abortion that there would have been after Roe v. Wade. And so the Pro-Life Committee was still kind of figuring out what its role would be, how it would operate. And so Bernadine saw this as an opportunity to really bring some creative, concrete ideas to that role. And then so he began that series of lectures. And then in 1995, he had surgery for pancreatic cancer. We can go to the next one. And then while he was in the process of treatment and ultimately of dying, he prepared this book of reflection, The Gift of Peace, which if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. Just kind of his personal experience of getting this diagnosis, of dying. I think he talks in there as well of an experience. He was accused of abuse by a man who later recanted his allegations. And so he talks about the struggle of dealing with that experience, but more so with his diagnosis of cancer and being and encountering people who are dying of cancer and then approaching death himself. And so he would be on the cover of a national magazine again. This is the Newsweek, the week after he died of cancer in November of, let's go to the next slide, in November of 1996. And this is referring to his book, Teaching Us How to Die. Let's go to the next. George Weigel, who is a fairly, I think he would even identify himself as a conservative commentator in the Catholic Church and the Catholic world. He described Cardinal Bernadine, and he would not normally agree with Cardinal Bernadine on some things, including probably the consistent ethic of life, although I don't know that for a fact. But he identified Cardinal Bernadine as arguably the most powerful Catholic prelate or bishop in American history, which is quite a statement. And I would agree with him. And here is another important moment in the life of Cardinal Bernadine. So that's me. I was ordained a deacon by Cardinal Bernadine on December 11th, 1994. And this is at our graduation that May at Mundelein Seminary. So after that, let's go back to Fordham in December of 1983. Any questions or comments about Cardinal Bernadine? Anybody meet him? Know him personally? Has he ever been to St. Anthony's Spirituality Center? I don't know. Yes, Paul. Here.
You mentioned the false accusation against him, but again, as a part of an ethic of life, I believe that man died of AIDS, and the cardinal came to his bedside at the time of his.
Excellent point. There was reconciliation, and Cardinal Bernadine did go to care for him as he was dying of AIDS. Correct. Yes, thank you for that. Any other comments or questions about him? Okay, let's go on back to Fordham. So this is his address. So the question is, should life ever be taken? So for centuries, going back to Thomas Aquinas and beyond, the church has proposed what it calls the just war theory, which allows that in certain circumstances, war is justified, just as it sounds. It's not as complicated as a theory might need to be. So for example, we could justify World War II in that we were addressing Nazi atrocities, or we could justify dropping the atomic bomb because we were going to prevent further bloodshed, etc. So as you can see, the just war theory can get kind of dicey. And then there were also exceptions for the death penalty in terms of how Catholics viewed that issue. Heinous murderers, etc. Maybe there could be a justification for their executions. The presumption is life, but there are exceptions. So remember our seamless garment. Remember, it's held together. And what happens if we make an exception and pull one of those strings out? Let's see what Cardinal Bernadine. So he gave this address in December 1983 at Fordham in New York on the front page of the New York Times, which, I would like, if I was doing a research project and I had hours and hours and days and weeks and months to figure this out, to go back, starting with today, when was the last time a teaching moment of a US bishop was on the front page of the New York Times? I hope there has been, but it's not really within my memory. But that was. Bernadine asked Catholics to fight both nuclear arms and abortion. So that linkage was profound. That blew people's minds. Okay, let's go on. Fundamental to the shift. So remember, Bernadine talked about this new moment. He talks about a shift in understanding. Fundamental to the shift is a more acute perception of the multiple ways in which life is threatened today. So again, the world is becoming more complicated, more technological. And with that, as he observes, there's a new context in which to view life. And the need for a consistent ethic of life, the attitude necessary to sustain that idea, and the principles needed to shape it. So he recognizes clearly that there is a need for this consistent ethic of life. But he also recognizes that there will be a need to change attitudes to make that, to bring that into the popular realm of consideration. And then also principles to give meat to the bones of the consistent ethic. So the need, let's talk about the need. Why is there a need for the consistent ethic of life? So I mentioned technology. We now threaten life on a scale previously unimaginable. Okay, so just think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, huh? If we can't even comprehend it. Talk about being unimaginable. And we could identify others. As he observed, there are new opportunities for care, but also for great threat and destruction. So that gets to the heart of the need. In an age when we can do almost anything, so again, this is in 1983. He could be saying this today, right? In an age in which we can do almost anything, how do we decide what we ought to do? The even more demanding question is, in a time when we can do anything, how do we decide morally what we never should do? That's a pastor's message. I mean, you couldn't say it any more clear, could you? Okay, let's keep going. So really, this is Cardinal Bernadine's presentation. I'm just saying his words, because why should I make this up myself when we can draw from him? So going to the attitude part of it. So now we have the need. Now we have to figure out, how do we develop the attitudes that help to address the need? Opposing abortion, war, the death penalty cultivates an attitude of respect for life in society. So it's not just focusing on an issue or this issue or that issue, but life itself. Okay, that's where we find the garment. Okay. The purpose of proposing a consistent ethic of life is to argue that success on any one of the issues, and we can see all the people promoting those various causes on the left, that success on any one of the issues threatening life requires a concern for the broader attitude about respect for human life. So Bernadine's idea in a nutshell is, if we are really going to end abortion, if we are really going to promote peace, if we are going to end capital punishment, or any number of other issues that we might speak of in a few moments, we have to promote life itself, that our success, our ability to address any of them, integral to that is a respect for human life across the board. So we get to the principle. There's a Catholic teaching on war. There's a Catholic teaching on abortion. Go to the next. Both, of course, must be seen in light of an attitude of respect for life. So we get from the attitude to the principle that prohibits the directly intended taking of innocent human life. Now, what about a convicted murderer? That makes it more complicated, but let's keep going. So he speaks of an unborn fetus, obviously an innocent human life, innocent civilian populations in war. So we see that just in the recent weeks in the war between Israel and Palestinian territories. In Gaza and other places in Palestinian territories, hundreds of civilians were killed, innocent civilians, okay? And Bernadine is linking these kinds of deadly situations. The principle which structures both cases, war and abortion, needs to be upheld in both places. It cannot be successfully sustained on one count and simultaneously eroded in a similar situation. It just isn't going to hold up. The garment is going to fray and fall apart. So what's the problem with this? What's the challenge, the ultimate challenge of what Bernadine's proposing? And you don't have to go back to 1983 to find the answer.
Well, we live in a country that has two political parties, and they view these issues differently. And this really, to me, was the teaching that for 2 decades gave the Catholic Church credibility, was that there was an underlying principle that the Catholic Church upheld that nobody else was really consistently looking at.
Right. So The problem here, as Mike said, is that this almost, and this happened with Cardinal Bernadine, is this almost immediately became a political battle. So certain folks in the Catholic Church wrote him off almost immediately because he was promoting this political agenda, or others didn't even pay any attention to him because he wasn't seeming to favor their political agenda. And so rather than really giving serious consideration, because this, as I said, this was mind-blowing. But rather than allowing their minds to be blown, people just stayed in their pockets, their political pockets or their issue pockets. So my issue was this, I'm not going to worry about that. Or this is my issue. So those people on the sides there, rarely did they meet at a protest. The top one says protect all life. But I don't know what the other signs say, but rarely did you see those signs at the same protest: abortion, peace, war and peace, the death penalty. Okay. When one carries this principle into the public debates today, and he would be saying it now, so today could be 1983 or 2021. When one carries this principle into the public debates today, one meets significant opposition from very different places on the political ideological spectrum. So we think that we are so divisive today, and I think we are more divisive than we were in 1983, but this is not a new phenomenon. We see this clearly on abortion and peace issues, and he contends the viability of the principle depends upon the consistency of the application. It works here, it has to work here too. The issue of consistency is tested when we examine the relationship. Now he's carrying it a step further. The issue of consistency is tested when we examine the relationship between right to life and quality of life, okay? And this is a key element of the consistent ethic of life as well. So what do we mean when we say life is sacred? And what responsibilities come with that claim? The Catholic position on abortion demands of us and of society that we seek to influence a heroic social ethic, a heroic way of living in society with one another. So I can't help when I read that statement, but think of Pope Francis's recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, which is, the English title is On Fraternity and Social Friendship, on living together with one another, in which he identifies as heroes of our day those who can engage in dialogue with people they disagree with. Those are people Francis identifies as contemporary heroes. Bernadine uses that phrase, heroic social ethics. So the people who pursue that are heroes. And so can you see now where he's going with this idea of right to life and quality of life? Let's see if your head's on track with where Cardinal Bernadine goes. If one contends, as we do, that the right of every fetus to be born should be protected by civil law and supported by civil consensus, then our moral, political, and economic responsibilities do not stop at the moment of birth. And that is a key piece of the life argument that too often gets lost, I fear. Those who protect the right to life of the weakest among us must be equally visible in support of the quality of life of the powerless among us, the young and the old, the hungry and homeless, the undocumented immigrant, and the unemployed worker. And so this affects how we will approach tax policy, job creation, welfare policy, nutrition and feeding programs, healthcare. So the consistent ethic of life, this seamless garment, has a lot of complicated threads in it, doesn't it? But can you see how this adds, how this is part of what he's talking about? Or does anyone have an objection to it? I just think as challenging as it is, it's also so necessary to make this, to see this as all part of one thing. Consistency means we cannot have it both ways. We cannot urge a compassionate society and vigorous public policy to protect the rights of the unborn and then argue that compassion and significant public programs on behalf of the needy undermine the moral fiber of society or are beyond the proper scope of government responsibility. You could be in Washington right now, or you could be watching CNN or Fox News right now and hear the same argument as it applies to programs that are being pursued in Congress today. And I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of that, but I think we need to look at the ideal of what Bernadine is saying. If we are going to promote life, then we have to find the programs that allow for the sustaining of life, of the regard for the dignity of the human person needs to be addressed in those pursuits. So the challenge and opportunity. What is the challenge of this? I don't remember. A consistent ethic of life must be held by a constituency to be effective. So people have to embrace what he's talking about. The challenge is meaningless if he just gives this talk and they put it in a book and then Father Tom puts it on his shelf, which is what I did for 30 years. That doesn't develop a constituency. So there needs to be people who embrace this. The building of such a constituency is precisely the task before the church and the nation. This was really a call to arms of sorts for the Catholic Church. The church and the larger society need to be engaged in this together. And he concludes, the challenge is worth our energy, resources, and our commitment as a church. So levels of the question. Abortion is taking a life in ever-growing numbers in our society. Those concerned about it, I believe, will find their case enhanced by taking note of the rapidly expanding use of public executions. So he takes us a step beyond now the War and Peace pastoral letter, which addressed kind of the integrity of life and talked a little bit about abortion and War and Peace. Now he's bringing another contemporary issue into the mix. In a similar way, those who are particularly concerned about these executions, even if the accused has taken another life, should recognize the elementary truth that a society which can be indifferent to the innocent life of an unborn child will not be easily stirred to concern for a convicted criminal. Now, those are two hard issues to kind of correlate, right? A convicted criminal, maybe a serial killer, and an unborn child. But he says we need to have a political, psychological, and moral linkage. A systemic vision of life seeks to expand the moral imagination of a society. So we need to allow our imaginations to expand in such a way that that convicted serial killer, sentenced to death, and the unborn fetus are linked. So what he has begun here, as he concludes his address at Fordham, is he establishes the seamless garment. And then as he goes on, he will add threads to the garment of sorts. He will speak, for example, to Catholic health organizations. He will give an address on pornography and sexual abuse. He will address the death penalty, speaking to judges in Cook County in Illinois. And also some of those public policy elements that we kind of referred to a little bit earlier. So he begins, and others, as they struggle with this idea, begin to add threads to the garment. Just a side note, the phrase seamless garment was not in the text of his address. In the Q&A afterwards, he used the phrase seamless garment almost in passing, but it became a very good and easily to kind of enhance the imagination of people, a nice phrase to use in referring to the consistent ethic. So where have we come? So Cardinal Bernadine gave that address at Fordham. He gave 10 other major lectures between 1983 and 1986. So where have we come since then? Most of you had never heard of the consistent ethic of life. Had you heard of the seamless garment? No. I mean, other than those who had heard of the consistent ethic of life. So where have we come? What's the legacy of Cardinal Bernadine's profound words? I want to identify him as a prophet, but can I if his words are forgotten and his message seems to have gone unheeded? I mean, I think they're still prophetic words, but if they just fall on deaf ears or don't even fall on deaf ears, if they just are well, I guess if they're just put on a shelf and no one knows them, what's the legacy of that? Well, we could conclude that the legacy died at some point, maybe not long after he did. But I don't think that's quite true. And I think the legacy of the consistent ethic continues to endure in various places. And yet it doesn't. And we'll kind of get to that in a bit too. Let's look at the legacy in terms of popes and presidents. I use popes and presidents because of alliteration. I mainly want to look at the popes. So John Paul II was Holy Father when Cardinal Bernadine, he appointed Cardinal Bernadine to Chicago. And often in his addresses, he would not use the term or the phrase consistent ethic of life or seamless garment, but he would say things that resonated very clearly with the ideals that Cardinal Bernadine had spoken of. And in the Gospel of Life, his encyclical in 1995 probably did that most clearly. In that encyclical, John Paul II wrote, "Every threat to human dignity is felt in the church's heart. It affects its faith and engages its mission of proclaiming the gospel of life. A proclamation especially pressing because of the new threats to the life of individuals and peoples, especially where life is weak and defenseless. Next to the old scourges of poverty, hunger, disease, violence, and war, new threats are arriving at an alarming scale." So you can kind of hear some of what we even heard tonight from Cardinal Bernadine in this brief statement. He talks about these new threats. So remember, Bernadine talked about the new technology and the things that allowed us to do things we never imagined doing before. As well as these old scourges, So there are the threads in the garment, huh? I repeat the words of the Second Vatican Council condemning crimes and attacks against human life. So this quote that's coming up is from the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes. We often think, if we think at all of the Second Vatican Council, if I were to ask you what was the most important thing that came out of the council or was said by the bishops at the council, we almost always say we started celebrating Mass in English or in the vernacular. And that was significant. It's still significant, and it's still a controversy in some places, as we know. But that was not the most important thing that came out of the Second Vatican Council. I think Gaudium et Spes, or the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, was, and it really got to the heart of why Pope John the 23rd called the Second Vatican Council in the first place. And I think you'll see what I'm getting at in this quote. "Whatever is opposed to life itself, such as any type of murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or willful self-destruction, whatever violates the integrity of the human person, such as mutilation, torments indicted on body or mind, attempts to coerce the will itself. Okay. Whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions where people are treated as mere tools for profit rather than as free and responsible persons. I just want to stop for a moment here because what John Paul II does here is refer back to the very beginning of what we call Catholic social teaching. So you hear that phrase tossed around from time to time. It began with an encyclical called Rerum Novarum in 1891. That addressed the rights and dignities of workers. So John Paul is taking us right back to the very beginning of Catholic social teaching. All these things and others of their kind are infamies indeed. They poison human society, but they do more harm to those who practice them than to those who suffer from injury. Moreover, they are a supreme dishonor to the Creator. And so that comes from Gaudium et Spes. In another passage from that encyclical or from that constitution, it will say what is the line? Basically the pain and hope of all the world are the pain and hope of the church. That we need to be engaged with all of those who suffer, and we need to be, as John Paul II is saying here, we need to be promoting life in all those pockets, all those different things that he listed where life and human dignity is threatened. So as he said, and this is the line that gets the most attention, we are confronted by a true structure of sin which takes the form of a culture of death. But John Paul II was only speaking of the culture of death so that we would become more committed to promoting a culture of life. Francis does some of the same thing in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, but some folks got so bogged down in that idea, well, we have a culture of death and that's just the world we live in, and that John Paul II was being negative or whatever referring to it. Well, he's referring to it because we need to create a world that is opposed to that culture. This culture denies solidarity and is fostered by currents that encourage a society that is excessively concerned with efficiency, okay? And who would be more guilty of that than Americans? Because we pride ourselves on our efficiency. It is in a certain sense a war of the powerful against the poor. And again, we see that even more clearly in our world today. So that's John Paul II. Kind of hanging in there with Bernadine, right? Don't you agree? Got kind of on track there. So what about Benedict the 16th? Gosh, how soon we forget. In his encyclical in 2009, The Charity of Truth, he writes, a society lacks solid foundations when, on the one hand, it asserts values such as the dignity of the person, justice, and peace. But then on the other hand, radically acts to the contrary by allowing or tolerating a variety of ways in which human life is devalued and violated, especially where it is weak or marginalized. What did Bernadine say, essentially? You can't have it both ways. You can't say, this is who we are, this is what we espouse, and then just ignore other things that seem in contradiction, that seem obvious contradictions to that. The dignity of the individual and the demands of justice require, particularly today, that economic choices do not cause disparities in wealth due to increase in an excessive and morally unacceptable manner, and that we continue to prioritize the goal of access to steady employment for everyone. So he's getting into the fine threads of the garment as he is addressing the world in this encyclical. The exclusion of religion from the public square, and at the other extreme, religious fundamentalism, hinders an encounter between persons and their collaboration for the progress of humanity. And I included that quote because one of Bernadine's primary goals, remember, was that the church would be immersed in this social dialogue, that the church, he saw the church as leading the way in that dialogue, in that struggle. And so Benedict also wants to be clear that religion is not excluded from the public square because we need to be engaged in that, which was a primary point of the Constitution and the Church in the modern world from Vatican II as well. Public life is sapped of its motivation, and politics takes on a domineering and aggressive character if more, I would say, charitable voices are not part of the conversation. Okay. So Benedict, kind of on track with Cardinal Bernadine as well. What about Francis? So Francis has produced what some folks are calling a trilogy of social teaching. Lots of great things come in threes. The first Star Wars movies, there were 3 of them. And there were 3 Godfather movies, Lord of the Rings. So like all good trilogies, Francis, he does one that seemed to go over well. It brings out another one. And we'll look at the 3 of them now. So the Joy of the Gospel in 2013. So for the most part, the Joy of the Gospel was addressing, living the gospel of Jesus and evangelizing one another, of sharing the good news, of living the good news and bringing others to know the good news. Among the vulnerable for whom the church wishes to care with particular love and concern are unborn children, the most defenseless and innocent among us. Frequently, as a way of ridiculing the church's effort to defend their lives, attempts are made to present our position as ideological, obscure, and conservative. So he's using the popular political term there. Yet, this defense of unborn life is closely linked to the defense of each and every other human right. It involves the conviction that a human being is always sacred and inviolable in any situation and at every stage of development. Somehow, Cardinal Bernadine from heaven was communicating to Pope Francis. Clearly. So that was in the Gospel of the Joy of the Gospel. His second part of the trilogy was Laudato Si, Our Common Home, which ostensibly people will say is about the environment. But of course, it's also then a life document as well. Cardinal or Pope Francis adding several important threads to the seamless garment. The human environment and natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. Okay. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. And we know this. I mean, we see the impact of climate change having very severe consequences in Africa, in some places, the more prevalence of hurricanes and things, how that affects Haiti and poorer countries in our own hemisphere. The impact of present imbalances is also seen in the premature death of many of the poor. We are faced not with 2 separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Back in the day when people actually talked about the seamless garment more, environmental concerns were often identified as part of that seamless garment, and some would poo-poo that as not being important enough or integral to what we were talking about. Well, Francis certainly puts that all on a different level, equating care for the environment as being fundamental to any protection of human life. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. So his third part of the trilogy was promulgated just last October in conjunction with the Feast of St. Francis. He went to Assisi and promulgated Fratelli Tutti. Its English title is On Fraternity and Social Friendship, which it would be better if it had a more catchy English title. I must say, on fraternity and social friendship just doesn't want you to grab it off the shelf, does it? But I would strongly encourage everyone to read Fratelli Tutti. It's as readable as Cardinal Bernadine's presentations, and just really so profound in terms of, we did a book club in the parish during Lent and Easter, and again and again, people would observe how aware he seemed to be of the real world for someone who, we kind of imagine living in, luxury in the Vatican. Francis really has his finger on the pulse of the world and its struggles. So he says in Fratelli Tutti, God has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignity, and has called them to live together as brothers and sisters. So where John Paul II used the phrase, a culture of death, Francis uses the term, a throwaway world. And they're both kind of talking about the same thing. What are we throwing away? We have grown indifferent to all kinds of wastefulness. The unborn, the elderly, food, throwing away food, which he says is deplorable in the extreme. Laborers getting low wages and working in dangerous conditions, going again back to Rerum Novarum from 1891. Environmental threat. So we see there the throwaway culture that he speaks of, and the detriment to human life and dignity that comes with that. Our individual concerns are the only thing that matter. That's a common theme in Fratelli Tutti. A readiness to discard others finds expression in vicious attitudes that we thought long past, such as racism. So remember, when he's writing this last October, what had been going on in the United States at that time and in the summer, the months preceding that. And it wasn't just in the United States, it was happening in other parts of the world as well. And now we would be seeing it in terms of incidents of anti-Semitism in our country and in other countries, because prompted, I guess, by some response to the Israeli bombings of the Palestinian territories. But again, how do you make these? How does one lead to the other? But anyway, the kind of thing that Francis is speaking to. War, terrorist attacks, racial or religious persecution, and many other affronts to human dignity are judged differently, depending on how convenient it proves for certain primarily economic interests. Okay, if it benefits me financially or my country, well, I guess we'll just have to allow that to happen. So, boy, lots of threads being pulled out of the garment on that with that idea. What is true as long as it is convenient for someone in power stops being true once it becomes inconvenient. These situations of violence, sad to say, have become so common. So now he's referring, I'm kind of jumping through the document, but he refers to all kinds of conflicts that are existing around the world and, various wars. And we could go around the room and we could identify, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Israel and Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq, El Salvador, Haiti is in turmoil. So we could identify lots of places where there's intense violence. And he speaks to this as constituting a third world war. Only just it's piecemeal, it's hodgepodges. And that really, I just think that's a stunning way for us to think about what's going on in our world today. Because when these things are happening in such isolated places, and they don't get a lot of attention, at least in our news, we just become indifferent to them. But he's seeing the potential of what that does to the world when you have all of that violence and war. And that phrase, Third World War, really seems powerful. And then also new walls are erected for self-preservation. We can see that on the border of our country. We see that in Israel, between Israel and the Palestinian territory. And walls are erected for all kinds of means of preservation. And then Francis also speaks of the COVID situation. And I think, you know, here again, in various ways in which we responded as individuals, as a society to the pandemic, kind of identifies how we might honor the consistent ethic of life, or whether we honored the consistent ethic of life, and whether we, and it's how we are still adapting to the pandemic or responding. So he says a worldwide tragedy like COVID momentarily revived a sense that we are united, huh? It seemed to do that, I guess. Once this health crisis passes, our worst response would be to plunge even more deeply into feverish consumerism and new forms of egotistic self-preservation. God willing, after all of this, we will no longer think in terms of them and those, but only us. Well, we'll see how that works, huh? If only this may prove not to be just another tragedy of history from which we learned nothing. And that you know, so there's one of the significant challenges that he puts forth in his encyclical. How many of you, so going again, and I wish we could see with the folks on Zoom, but how many of you had heard of Fratelli Tutti? So more of you have heard of that. And that's good in that that message can kind of resonate a bit more than as we're familiar with it. Maybe our pastors preach about it a bit, provide opportunities to introduce us to it, that its message might take root, because again, it's really another instance of what Cardinal Bernadine was talking about in the consistent ethic of life. So we talked a little bit about the popes and how they have not, and they were not, and I don't want to give you the impression that they were doing this because Cardinal Bernadine had said it, but what he was saying, first of all, it wasn't necessarily new to him. It was just the way he kind of packaged it and talked about it and presented it as this new moment of the church leading the rest of the country in a more substantive understanding of life and the dignity of human life. And again, John Paul II didn't get the idea from Bernadine, but Benedict, John Paul, and Francis, all in their own way, are presenting that idea of the seamless garment as they promote human life. So the popes have kind of been carrying that baton a bit. What about our presidents? Let's put up the rogues gallery. There they are. The presidents of the post-seamless garment era, or the seamless garment era. And we don't need to go through the list of issues. But what we see by looking at those folks is that clearly the seamless garment does not lead to partisan one-party voting. We cannot, as people who adhere to a consistent ethic of life, say, I am always going to vote this way. Even if, and the bishops have said this in various ways, even if, let's just say, this candidate is opposed to abortion, we might want to very seriously look at how that candidate addresses other issues related to life and the dignity of life, okay? So how does this candidate or this elected official help to create a world in which a young woman will be more confident to give birth to a child? Those are the complicated questions that come into play as we consider the consistent ethic of life. Or so this candidate is opposed to abortion, and this candidate is opposed to abortion, supports the death penalty, has led us into war. We could, what we know by looking at this menagerie is that these are not easy political decisions that we are brought to by the consistent ethic. If anything, we have to struggle even more when we go to vote. And Joe Biden's not up there. Shoot, here I thought I had everybody. And President Biden is a complicated figure on this front, huh? President Trump was a complicated figure on this front. And so, boy, I would just love for President Biden to announce tomorrow that, you know, folks, hey, I read this speech that Cardinal Bernadine, Chicago, great guy. I read this speech he gave at Fordham in 1983, and hey, he persuaded me. I would love for that to happen, but it probably won't. And so we still continue to try to figure out how best to vote and how to address in the other realm of public life, how we address the issues and promote life in all its forms. And so what about the US bishops? So we talked about the pastoral letter on war and peace and the pastoral letter on economic justice. And that was really the last of the pastoral letters put forth by the bishops. They do if it's every 2 years or every 4 years, faithful citizenship, where they have a document to help people in terms of voting. But it seems to have gotten weaker over the years in terms of how it addresses the seamless garment idea of life. It seems to be kind of creating this idea of that there are safe partisan pockets that we can kind of enter into. So I guess I'll be quite blunt in that the bishops, I think, have failed in honoring the vision of Cardinal Bernadine. He put this out there for the whole church, and it really was up to the bishops, his brother bishops at his time and then after, to take that and to run with it. And I think they've allowed themselves, and priests and others have allowed ourselves as well, to kind of get bogged down into those partisan divisions. And that threatens the integrity of the seamless garment dramatically. I just hope, using the idea of Pope Francis in this encyclical, where he talks about our contemporary heroes, I hope that there might be a contemporary hero among the bishops today who might take up the cause of Cardinal Bernadine and see a new moment today. All the pieces are still there that were there in 1983. We just need somebody to start putting them together again and guiding us. Yes.
Not an American example, but in the struggle in Myanmar, on YouTube, you would see a nun that presented herself before the soldiers and the police, urging that they spare students. And the Cardinal in Myanmar has been very noble in the effort for democratization. The Pope was unable to even say Rohingya while he was there, but did when he reached Bangladesh. And to me, I see that Cardinal as something of a hero.
And certainly to that point, we see heroes in lots of other places. Oscar Romero would be one from another era in El Salvador. But I want to see heroes among our bishops and priests. And so I wait and hope. So one of the things in the first chapter of Fratelli Tutti, Francis goes on talks about the darkness, dark clouds looming over the world, and he kind of goes on in a pretty honest way of assessing the status of the world. But then at the end, he says, "But we must live in hope. We must persevere in hope." So, and that's where I am at this question. I hope. Any questions or comments? We're done, aren't we? I know, but we're not going to have time for the video. Let's just play we have 5 minutes. So I wanted to end with Cardinal Bernadine having the last word. And this is an address that he gave at Georgetown. So he made his way to all the top Catholic colleges: Seattle University, St. Louis University, Fordham, and then he ended here. This was his last public address on September 10th, 1996. It was 11 days after he had announced that he was dying of cancer when he gave this address. He died in November, and this was in September at Georgetown. And it was on C-SPAN the night he died in November. And we're just joining it. Yeah. We're just joining you.
Constitutional issues of church and state, societal issues of how best to structure civil society, and empirical issues of operational effectiveness. It's a far-reaching argument, but it must be undertaken because today too many suffer from the lack of an effective and humane policy vision. And this brings me to the third section, the sacredness of life, religion, culture, and politics. In this concluding section of my address, I return to the consistent ethic of life. Thus far this afternoon, in addressing religion and politics, justice and economics,
It does this.
I have sought to reflect upon how we care for life in our midst, both personally and through public policy. Caring for life, supporting it, and responding to basic human needs of nutrition, health care, education, and housing are an essential aspect of the consistent ethic. As I have indicated, I believe we have yet a substantial way to go in caring for the lives of the least among us. But in the contemporary U.S. context, caring for life does not exhaust our moral obligations. We now face in the 1990s profoundly threatening public issues where life is being taken, where life is being destroyed without moral justification. In proposing the consistent ethic over a decade ago, my purpose was to help create a dialogue about the full range of threats to life which modern society poses. I recognize the difference between the obligation to care for life and that to defend life against attack. I recognize that the moral failure to care for life adequately is different from the moral crime of taking an innocent life. But I was convinced, and I still am firmly convinced, that the overriding moral need in our society is to cultivate a conviction that we must face all the major threats to life, not only one or two. The consistent ethic precisely seeks to relate our moral analysis to different kinds of moral problems. It seeks to provide a framework within which individuals and groups who begin with the concern for one moral dimension of life can be brought to the threat posed by other issues in our society.
So it's 8
When
o'clock.
we shift our focus,
I think we should let that go, but I wanted you to have a chance to actually hear his voice kind of speaking to some of what we've talked about tonight. Any questions, comments? Are there questions? Do we have questions from the peanut gallery? We don't. Okay. Thank you all very much for your attention. Let's go promote life, okay? Let's not just sit and listen or read quotes on a board. Let's really try to embrace what Cardinal Bernadine has set before us and that others have tried to encourage as well. So thank you all very much. Have a good night. God bless.
Thank you, Father Tom. Next month, we have Father Dennis Lynch, who will be speaking on care for God's creation. That's June 24th. Invite friends to come in person or to be on Zoom. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening.
First, before you do that. So when Father Dennis says, have you heard of Laudato Si, the second part of the trilogy, you can all raise your hands, okay?
All right. Thank you for everyone for coming, for joining us this evening. We hope that you will join us next month, June 24th. And everyone have a blessed evening and a safe and fun Memorial weekend. Thank you.